Yeah, let's start. I'm just going to first, first, thank you very much, Prabha, for joining us at an early morning hour. But as you pointed out yourself, you are an early bird, so you are actually in the middle of your day.
That's it. Thank you.
But anyway, thank you for making the time for us. I'm sure it's going to be a great conversation. We'll keep it very informal and loose. Prabha, just for by way of introduction to those who haven't heard of or met Prabha before, she's one of those unique people who went from India, got a PhD in the US, and then worked there in the biopharmaceutical industry. Until that, it's not that unique. But the unique part came later when she moved into the startup world and she worked in her own company for a few years, and then she became the CEO of a contract research organization. Then she worked for another company, which is again her own company, which she founded. So I think she has the widest experience of among the many people that I know. So I think I'm sure she'll have some extremely interesting stories to tell this audience. So we are looking forward to the wonderful event today. Another point I want to make is that this may go on a little longer than usual. We usually have an hour for this session. If there are a lot of questions, then we don't mind extending it by 15 minutes. So please stay on till the end and find and put in your questions and get the answers to your questions. So don't hang up at 1 hour. We will be on until the questions are coming to us. And the other announcement I want to make is that this is the magazine Shastra. It is a production from IIT Madras. It is a magazine which is about a year old now, and they are modeled on MIT Technology Review. They are trying to be India's MIT Technology Review, and hopefully eventually they will become better than the MIT Technology Review. And this is a science magazine. It's also a technology magazine coming from IIT Madras. And the announcement I wanted to make is that instead of giving away these cash prizes, which means something to somebody for a very short period of time, we decided to give a year subscription to Shastra for all the winners of the best questions that are asked. So keep the questions coming, and hopefully you will get a subscription to Shastra as well. Now, Prabha, shall we start? I mean, is there anything you want to get started by saying?
First, thank you very much. It's a tremendous honor. I still, of course, have family in India, and I still love India. Even though I've been in the US for over 50 years, India is my primary home still, interestingly.
That's good. Yeah. So maybe we will start at that point. I mean, you actually are studied in Bangalore. You are just mentioning that you are from Bangalore, but you studied in Bangalore and then you went to Vellore. And we had one previous in conversation guest, Ajit Varki, whom you might have heard of.
Oh, yes.
The glycobiologist. He's got exactly the same thing. He went from Bangalore to Vellore and then he became a glycobiologist, but he stayed in academia. He may have engaged with.
Yeah, he's in California. Yeah, he publishes.
Yeah,
I know of him. Yeah,
so,
he's younger than me.
Okay. So we had him on this show a few episodes back, and you had the same career path. Now, let me ask you a few questions. Why did you want to go to Vellore from Bangalore, and how did your decision making happen in terms of becoming a microbiologist? And it's a good thing you went to Vellore because one of the premier places for microbiology research in India at that time, and maybe even now. So can you just explain, was it a very conscious thought process, or was it, yeah, CMC Vellore is great, let me go there, kind of thing?
No, actually, I was always interested in biology, always. Even as far as my memory goes back, even when I was 8, 9 years old, I was very interested in biology. But I was not interested in human medicine. I was more into animal welfare and plant welfare and so on at those times. And so I wanted to be a veterinary doctor. My father said no. And also the veterinary schools were not admitting women because of the large animal care at that time. This was, 1968, 69, long time ago, right? So I was not interested in human medicine. I met my cousin who was in medical school at in Vellore, and he suggested I applied for my master's in one of the medical sciences, and then I could move on. There was pharmacy, there was microbiology, biochemistry, etc. Right? And so I picked microbiology and applied, and it's very competitive. There are only 2 seats per year, very competitive. I got in, and there I was. So that's what made me go there. As usual, my father was not for it. My mother said, "Oh, go for it." So that was the end of that. I was there.
Okay. And then from there, you came to the US, right? You finished your master's, you directly came to the US after that. And what was triggering? Was it more of a family?
I married a Catholic in India. I'm a
Okay.
Brahmin. Yeah,
Okay.
that was the trigger. Leave India.
Okay. Oh, okay. So even in those days, it was kind of, I
It
guess,
was very bad
very
those
bad.
days. Not
Okay.
not now, but
Okay.
we went to Belgium, which was the first country which gave us a visa. I actually stayed with a friend in Madras, a
Okay.
school friend,
Okay.
and then directly went on to Belgium, where I did immunochemistry.
Okay. Oh, okay. So you felt unwelcome after your wedding because of the nature
Yeah,
of the.
there was no wedding. We got married over a lunch break with the registrar. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So that now, was that a very Prabha thing to do? I mean, I don't think young women in those days, many of them were doing that.
My mother was a freedom fighter for Gandhi. She was in jail a number of times. So it must be genetics.
Okay, that explains it. So you came to the US and eventually you were through Belgium, then you
So
moved
I worked in Belgium for 2 years, and that
to
was actually very important because it was a stepping stone to the US. I'd never been in the Western world before that.
Okay,
I was only 21, not even 21.
okay,
So went to Europe, and it's nice. People are more welcome. There isn't that much crime there. Streets are clean. And so you have a good image, and you think, okay, this is the West, which we saw in India, was America, right? Was really Europe.
hmm,
And people were very kind, and so on. And I got the opportunity to work in a Western lab. Not that CMC was down, CMC was very good,
hmm,
but at immunochemistry there. And it was wonderful. Those were the heydays of transplantation. Remember, kidney transplantation came into the 70s.
hmm,
And we were there. This was the head of the European kidney transplantation. Then my husband, Michael, was working,
hmm.
had gotten a job as a fellow, renal fellow. And so I got to learn about histocompatibility antigens and typing those and looking at various enzymes in the transplant things when you could predict the transplant rejection. All of the, I met people like Octoloni. We hear about Octoloni immunoprecipitate. They came and we had tea together, in the laboratory. I got to, Rima was my boss, the head of the lab.
Okay.
And he was the one who first used agar gel for electrophoresis. That's how long ago that was.
Okay.
But I knew some of the big names,
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah, Van Rood, all these people who are in textbooks now as the originators of these. They used to
Yeah.
come for tea with Vima.
Okay. So you were there for 2 years, and then by why,
Almost 2 years.
if you were there doing well and you moved to the US, why was that? What predicated that?
So my brother-in-law, Mike's brother, was at Rutgers. He was finishing his PhD, and we knew in Europe that as Indians in Europe, in Belgium in particular, you could never rise to the top. You could never progress. You would always be an underling. And
Okay.
so and people told us that. Although they were very upset about going to the US because US still had a lot of bad name, which it still has, for discrimination against colored people, et cetera, et cetera. So, but my brother-in-law was very convincing, said you can progress just as well in the US. So we came to the US. My husband, he was a renal fellow, and he came into Hanuman Hospital with a practice there. And I came in with the wrong visa. I walked the streets. Nobody will believe this. I mean, I was without a job for almost 3 to 4 months, maybe more longer. I walked the streets, went from interview to interview. I had a sari on, etc. And I was walking in on the streets of Philadelphia looking for a job. And nobody would hire me. I was interviewed at the Vista Institute, and they said, we love your background, but we can't hire you. You don't have a work visa. So,
Okay.
I was at home, I was very depressed because I said, I can't work in this country. And there was no way to change the visa unless somebody offered you a job. They would have to apply for you.
Hmm.
And that was very hard. And so, I was not a medical doctor. It was much harder. But then, there's always luck in life. I ran into, at Thomas Jefferson University in the hospital lab, a lady called Dr. Eileen Randall. She's a wonderful person. She heard my story. She said, "You report into work tomorrow. I'll take care of your visa." And she did. My visa came by mail. I don't know what she told that officer. She's a very, very tough lady. And she had no nonsense about her. And after about 3 months or so, she said, "You're too good to be just working in the hospital lab. You need to get your PhD." She introduced me to the chairman of microbiology, Dr. Russell Shadler. He's very well known for intestinal microflora those days. Right now, I mean, we use Shadler agar, Shadler broth. That was the head of department. And he said, "Why would an Indian woman who's married want to do a PhD? You're taking away a seat from somebody else. You're losing a seat." I mean, he was really, I mean, he'd be penalized now. You can't say things like, but those days you could say those things. So so Randall was very, very smart. She made me give an evening seminar. There was an Eastern branch of the ASM talk. And I gave a talk, and apparently it was good enough that Russell Shadler called me the next day and said, "When do you want to start graduate school?" So I did. And that's how it started. And I finished my PhD in less than 2 years. I worked every day of the week, 7 days. And after, I walked up, got my big thing from Ronnie Dubose himself, my PhD diploma. And then I got a call from the office. It said, "You can't graduate before 2 years." I'd already graduated. And so then they had to make an exception that this was an exceptional case. So I graduated in 1975 with my PhD.
And you were then how old, to 23 or 24?
Well, I was 24, 25, something
24,
like that.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. So you were always out to prove something. Is that what was driving you to work so hard? I mean, is it kind of?
Well, the whole idea is, for me, work is not work. It's an enthusiasm and interest, and you're driven because you want to do the next experiment and get the answers.
Okay.
And it's not because it's work. You can't be just tired from work.
Okay.
Because you want to know the answer. And so, we worked hard. And then I did postdocs a couple of years. And then I was a clinical postdoc at Temple. And interestingly, I had gotten a grant at Temple University as a postdoc. And I saw that there was a lot of jealousy. And especially as a woman, an Indian woman, I was still wearing a sari. And, there was a lot of discrimination. They were trying to take away my space just because I'd gotten money for research. So I said, enough is enough. I had a student, and my student suggested, get into the industry. So then I applied for industrial jobs. And again, I got a couple of interviews, but I did not get an offer. And my student, Anna Feldman, she's no more, she's passed away. She said to me, "Prabha, you're brilliant, but you need to look like one of us. If not, you will not get a good job." It was very interesting. So I shed my sari, I got my first suit, I wore, and guess what? I got the job. It's amazing. What do they say? Yeah. When you're in Rome, do as the Romans do. That was what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. You made them feel comfortable when they were hiring.
Yeah. Otherwise, they think you're wonderful, you're beautiful, this, that, and the other. But, can you be one of us and work with us? Yeah. So, you've got to blend in. So I did that. And I never did look back. And I had a fantastic mentor, Richard Sykes. He's now Sir Richard. He was then head CEO of Glaxo and so on. He did the merger with Young Leslie at SmithKline. And we worked on H3NAM. I did all of the in vivo work. And see, everything in life, you learn. There's no such a thing as wasted knowledge. The more you learn, the more you gain anything, you can connect the dots. So it was interesting. At Squid, Glaxo had a broad spectrum antibiotic. We had a narrow spectrum antibiotic, Azactam, H3NAM. And the market was not ready for a narrow spectrum drug. So I said, this has a huge advantage because it does not affect your bowel flora. Otherwise, you take a broad spectrum antibiotic, you have diarrhea, you have C. difficile colitis, right? In those days, you didn't know about colitis. So we showed that, and it was one of the biggest talks which were given at ICAC. I showed the microflora effect of the broad spectrum drug from Glaxo versus our drug and showed it. So, we got a narrow spectrum drug and we had to show why it was better for which patient. So we did that, and it was a successful product. It's still a successful product. In fact, now it works against the New Delhi strain, so it's very good.
Yeah.
So then from there, I went on to Abbott. And that's because Mike had left from the academic career and went to a company in near Searle, which was together with Searle. And I was head of microbiology at Abbott.
In Chicago.
And in Chicago. And it was interesting because Midwestern culture, old people in the lab, and they didn't want this young woman, foreign woman, coming as their boss. So the whole idea was to show what one can do, what one knows, and gain their respect. And I learned this actually in Vellore. There were 2 lessons I learned in Vellore. Many lessons, but 2 very important lessons. One day we were standing by the elevator, waiting. We were on the 3rd floor, and those floors in India are very high. So we decided we would take the elevator. We had books in our hand and all that. And Dr. Myers, Ruth Myers, who was head of virology, she had a polio victim. She was on crutches, and she climbed up the stairway with her crutches, and I watched her while we were waiting for the elevator. So I ran into her that day, and I said, Dr. Myers, can I ask you a question? I said, why didn't you wait for the elevator with us? She looked at me and she said, Prabha, you use it or lose it. I'll never forget. I never took the elevator again. The other thing is working hard, right? And the second thing is that Dr. Grace Coe, she was the head of Department of Microbiology. And we had our labor union strike in Vellore. And, all of us were working in the laboratory as master's students, and all the technicians, we were there. Many of the laborers were out. Some of the technicians were out. Some of the people collected samples were out. We had to go do everything. And while we were doing the culture, we had to make our own blood agar plates. Those days, you can buy blood agar. We had to make the blood agar plates. And we ran out of sheep blood. So I went to Dr. Koshi and I said, I can't make any more sheep blood agar plates because we don't have sheep blood. She says, well, we have sheep in the farm. We have to go collect the blood. I said, well, who do we call? All the laborers are out on strike. She said, you do it. I said, I bleed a sheep, She says, yes, I will show you. And so she walked with me to the farm. We had this big bottle with a needle, and she showed me, she told one guy to hold the sheep. She went into the jugular, got the blood, and she said, it's your turn, and gave me the thing. I almost passed out, but anyway, I did it.
So you came close to doing veterinary medicine.
So anyway, so we came back to things. So the point is, I remember, we had to do cardiac punctures to get, antibodies from rabbits and stuff during our work at Abbott. And I knew how to do cardiac punctures, of course, very well. And all these guys wanted to hold the rabbit, anesthetize it and all that. I said, no, just hold it tight, I'll do it. So I went straight into the heart, got the blood, and gave them the blood. The word spread, behave yourself, because she will get blood out of your heart in a minute. I got a lot of respect from doing every little bit of work which other people had to do. Yeah.
So you would have actually made a great veterinary physician, I think. India missed a great veterinary physician. You got a great drug discovery person. So I had a question. So you moved through these corporate roles, right? And I don't know how corporate culture was in those days, but I have had some experience of working in American corporations much later. And they tend to be, depending on the level of the organization, there is old boys network, and there are these conversations that are very macho kind of thing, that are exclusive, that a small group of people.
I can't go golfing, forget it.
Yes. So did you have that feeling of being excluded from the conversation, at least the informal conversation that are happening in these companies?
So, yeah, they all went golfing, they had their gossips, they had their stuff, and I'm sure they said stuff about me. It didn't matter for me. So, I had certain advantages. They could never call me names. They had to treat me like a lady. And I could do whatever I wanted. They couldn't say anything against me. Okay. I had advantages. So I took advantage of that. So, I showed them I was better. So I remember one time, entrepreneur who was my boss, very sweet man, I love him. He came to me and he says, Prabha, you got to come golfing. You're really missing a lot of fun. So I said, Andre, if I go out to golf, who's going to do your work? He never asked me to golf again.
So, okay,
So,
so
I could say that back to him because I was a young woman.
yeah, a little bit about we missed talking about the science you did for your PhD, and I know you did some work on dopamine receptors in the course of doing all this.
No, I did
Can
work
I
on
touch on
Vibrio
those two
cholerae.
things? Yeah?
Yeah, I
Sorry?
did Vibrio cholerae work for my PhD and
Okay.
toxin production and effect of intestinal microflora on Vibrio cholerae growth. That was
Okay.
my
Okay.
PhD.
Okay.
I was pretty much a microbiologist. I worked in the hospital lab, during my graduate school days, so I could earn a little bit more to support my thing because Mike was earning, of course, and I was too. I had a scholarship from the grant application, but I continued to head microbiology, worked on antibiotics. As you know, I worked on clarithromycin. So the story of clarithromycin is interesting. Clarithromycin we developed and was killed twice actually at Abbott. And both times I saved it. The second time, the senior vice president, head of entrepreneur, who was my boss, said, I'm going to nail this coffin so tight, no one can open it. Okay, because the first time it killed, I resurrected it and took it forward. I was very upset. I went to the president of Abbott Labs. Normally you would not get an appointment, but because I'm a woman and asking for a meeting, I got it. See, that you have to take advantage of what you got in life.
Yeah.
So I got my meeting with Paul Clark, and I told him that this good drug is being killed. It was being killed for teratogenicity.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, and this is why knowledge is very important. Captopril, which is a blockbuster drug from squid as an ACE inhibitor, was also teratogenic and was widely used. I said, teratogenicity is limited in certain populations, that's it. So you can actually get this drug approved. And I showed him why it was better. He called Dr. Janicki, who was the person who had killed it, and said it was going to go back up and running. Dr. Janicki was so angry with me. He came into my office. I thought he was going to kill me, but there was no way. His boss had told him, you're going to get this back up and running. It ran. I'm known as the mother of clarithromycin because of that.
Okay. Okay. So
I could have lost my job, but you can't worry about losing your job. You have to stand on your principles.
I'm curious to know why he was so interested in putting the nail in the coffin of the drug. I mean, what did he
Because
have?
it was teratogenic. It was teratogenic. So he thought of safety issues. He did not want the drug.
Okay. Okay. So you also told me once that being diminutive, being petite, was it an advantage or a disadvantage? I mean,
It's both. So you have to make every disadvantage an advantage. So
Okay.
being a woman, a minority, and short, you can actually, nobody kind of sees you. You can do things without being seen. Nobody, you're not, if you don't want to be known and noticed, you kind of sit there quietly and nobody will see you. So there's an advantage to it. And people treat you a little bit more gently because you're a smaller person. They don't realize, it's like a small chili, it'll get to you.
Only when it hits them. So you then moved to, why did you leave corporate America? Because I'm sure they paid you very well.
Yeah.
And you left that and you plunged. And this is a very unusual part of your story, right? So I was thinking about how to say it. There are lots of people who are given extraordinary lives, but they live it ordinarily. But then there are lots of people who are given ordinary lives, but they live it extraordinarily. I think you belong to the latter tribe. You have what could have been a very ordinary life, but you lived it in a very extraordinary.
So I'm obviously a risk taker, right? I left India. I did all these things, and so at Bristol Myers Squibb from Abbott. Mike moved back to Philadelphia for another corporate job. And so I had to come back to Squibb. And Squibb wanted me to come back badly because ever since I left, for some reason, Richard left. And then they wanted me back. They thought I was a go-getter because Abbott had done so well in microbiology. So I told Bill Scott, who was interviewing me, who was the senior VP at Squibb, that I didn't want to come back and do any microbiology. He said, well, what do you want to do? You're a microbiologist. I said, well, I want to do molecular biology because those were the heydays of microbiology, molecular biology. I wanted to become a molecular biologist. I had no molecular biology in my background. And I said, I want to be director of molecular biology. But for that, I want you guys to pay for me to go to Cold Spring Harbor and come back as a card-carrying molecular biologist. So there's nobody who respect me. It was not easy those days because I had 2 young children at home. Mike was working. So I went off to Cold Spring Harbor, came back as a card-carrying molecular biologist, doing my own laundry, staying in the student dorms, doing all that after having been a very senior person at Bristol Myers Squibb. And then I came back as director of molecular biology. And then the merger happened with Bristol Myers Squibb, and I became a vice president. And of course, a lot of people asking, how did you break the glass ceiling and this, that, and the other? But after, in 1997, I was also head of the biotech licensing committee for Squibb, Bristol Myers Squibb. And we were giving a lot of deals. I could sign $30 million deals, $40 million deals. I was signing them, and companies were getting this. I was working with them. I could hear the excitement in the biotech company's staff. And, I was kind of jealous, but I had the helicopter to order, plane to order. I could fly to Montreal, fly to Seattle, fly to Tokyo on my own plane. It was nice, what they call golden handcuffs, was good. And then, I was coming back from Japan and China, actually, in 1997, when I was found to have, I thought I had cancer, uterine cancer. It turned out to be a large external fibroid. And as I was recovering, I said, while I thought I had cancer, I said, shit, why did I do this with my life? I should have done biotech. So once I got better, I said when I was dying, I thought I was dying, I was going to do biotech. Well, now I'm going to do biotech, right? And I still had children which had to go through college, but I quit this real good job, VP job at Bristol Myers Squibb. They gave you a car, they gave you planes, helicopters, whole things. And I started my own biotech. So that got me, that's where the fun was. That's what I wanted to do. I said, okay, freedom to do what you want to do.
Yeah, but what are the mechanics of doing it? Let's say you are a corporate executive and you wanted to do a startup. How do you go about it? I mean, how did you go? How exactly did it happen to you? The steps.
Yeah, so I had a friend who had some technology.
Okay.
Protein interaction technology.
Okay.
And all the venture capitalists knew me because I was funding all their companies from Bristol Myers Squibb.
Okay.
So the moment I called, they called back. I met with them, and I think over, I had not yet even quit BMS. I had already gotten $10 million in the pocket, and so I left with that technology. We were ahead of our time because I was told, I remember, by people from SmithKline and Merck, that you can't block protein interactions with a small molecule. I couldn't believe it. Yeah, that was what they said to us. But now, of course, you do it all the time. We were just ahead of technologies, just like microflora, we were ahead of it.
Yeah, and you there was this company Morphochem that
that was Small Molecule Therapeutics, which was acquired by Morphochem in Germany.
Okay.
And then I went on to. So here's another problem. When you are a big shot in a big company, you think you're a big shot. People tell you you're a big shot. So you get brainwashed into thinking you're a big shot. You're not. You're as ignorant as anybody else. Okay. So when you started a company, I realized it's Small Molecule Therapeutics that I really knew nothing because it was other people who did the work, who did the toxicology, what is the meaning of GMP? What is the meaning of GLP? What exactly is it to do a contract? What is it? Who designs the budget, finances, right? You don't really know that. You sign off on all these things. You don't really know the details. And as a small company in a biotech, you've got to know how to do a report, how to submit something to the FDA. What is an IND? How do you write an IND? There is so much detail, which all the various departments in a big company take care of. And that's why I took on the job at Recerca to learn contract work, to learn toxicology. I worked in the toxicology lab. I worked in the bioanalytical lab. I worked in the CMC, I'm not a chemist, but I worked at the process lab. I worked in the manufacturing facility just to learn what is all this stuff? What are the details? For 6 months, I said, you guys have to leave me alone to the investors. So I learned every little bit of this, and I did. And then we set up all that. And,
but you were the CEO at Recerca, right?
Yes. And but again, a Midwestern
you're saying that you also went into the labs and you worked in the labs, and or you were.
I wore a hard hat and went into the chemistry labs. Yes.
Okay. And did the board of directors of Recerca think that is strange, or did they appreciate your?
No, I told them that was part of my thing for hiring. It's just like at Squibb. I wanted to be a molecular biologist, and I said, "You're going to leave me alone for 3 months. Pay for me to do that."
Okay.
And you do that, then I'm there as your CEO. And because I don't want to tell somebody to do something I don't know
Right.
what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why they would see it as a positive, unless they felt that you had more important things to do as a CEO, that you shouldn't get distracted doing learning things that other
But
people
to
do.
get contracts, you have to really know what you're selling. So
Yeah,
it's good. Yeah.
yeah.
No, we did that. We grew the company. I let go a lot of people. We grew that company, and then I got bored because in a contract work, you're not
Yeah.
doing discovery work, right? It was
Yeah.
boring.
Yeah.
So then I did my Darpharma, my dopamine receptors. Yeah.
So tell me about that. Dopamine receptors is nothing to do with microbiology and what
Yeah. So we
and
were
things
having
like
some
that.
problems. A second child is an adopted child.
Okay.
And so we were having some problem, although in your own child, you could have problems too. But then I realized it was all about dopamine receptors in the brain.
Okay.
And, I was reading about it. And, in every textbook, if you look, the CNS is always the last chapter because, you can actually pass your exams without reading that last chapter. Anatomy, biochemistry, last chapter is always CNS because there's such little known in the 70s about the brain. Even now we know little about the brain, but those days we hardly knew anything other than the structure. So I said, I got to study these receptors. What are they about? It was just totally fortuitous. I got this call from the founders of Darpharma who said that they wanted me to come and be CEO in North Carolina. I lived in Princeton. And I said, I think you got the long Fernandes because I don't know anything about dopamine receptors or the brain. They said, we know that. We're going to teach you that. Well, we know you can build a company and raise money. So that's why I joined Darpharma, and you'll see me a couple of papers on schizophrenia. We took our compound into phase 1, and that was bought by BioValve. And I read it again, like for the 4th time, I think, and then I started Central right after that. Yeah.
Okay, so the people who brought you into Darpharma, were they the investors in Darpharma?
Yeah, they're the founders, and we had some other investors in there. We also got NIH money for it.
Okay.
And I am National Minister of Mental Health. David Nichols, and who's well known in the psychedelic area now. And I think this one is frozen.
Yeah, your video is frozen, but your voice is clear.
Okay, we'll start that again. Yeah, there's good.
Yeah,
So, but it was great experience, and it helps you understand how the neural connections work. And now you know a whole lot more. Not that we know a whole lot about the brain, but we know much more now than we've ever done. And that the neural connections are actually made right in the uterus.
Yeah.
And starts right there. So if it's not made properly there, it goes on. So if, drug addicts, babies born to drug addicts, etc., can have big problems because of that.
So it looks like you're the kind of person who faces a challenge or a problem, and then you say, I'm going to solve it. And you do whatever it takes to solve it. You don't say that, oh, I'm not a neuro person, I'm not a molecular biologist, and therefore I can't do it. You say, I'll do it. And you just go out and do it.
But be honest about it. You tell people what you don't know.
Yeah, and to some extent, maybe the US is much more accommodating for people like you. Would you say that?
I don't think so. I think, it depends on the way. If you have a strength, everybody has a weakness. No one on earth is born knowing everything. As long as people know you have proven that you can learn whatever else is missing, but you have what they want, how to build a company, how to do this, how to apply to the FDA. There are certain things which they want, then they'll hire you because you've already shown you can learn something you don't know.
Yeah,
and you can always hire a person who knows the science and learn from them.
So it looks like you had a great relationship with your investors. I mean, whether it was
No.
now let's come to that. So because one of the captions I had for announcing this talk was that, do VCs eat entrepreneurs for lunch? I mean, I've heard that somewhere being said before. So tell us about your engagements and mishaps and positive things that happened with the investor community.
So you have to read a book called Startup. It's written by a person from J&J who had interviewed me and so on. And I told him to interview 9 other people, not just me, for his book. But I'm also in the book. So you can read the book called Startup.
Okay.
And venture capitalists are called vulture capitalists for a good reason. They're in there to make profit. But if it's your money they're investing, you want them to make a profit. So you see, initially you're on the same page. You want to start the company, but after a little while you diverge. They're on their own page. They want to make 10x their profits. You want to build a company and wait for a while to make their profit. Yeah. Eventually, everybody wants to make a profit, but our goal is to make a product. Their goal is to make money and to make it quickly. The problem with pharmaceuticals is that it takes time to build the molecule. It takes build to do development. That's the problem. They don't have the time. They want you to be acquired. So that's where you split. So I always have, I don't believe that you should have an enemy in the world. I really don't have an enemy in the world. People say, no, don't you hate so-and-so? I said, no, I don't hate anyone. I still speak to every single one of my venture capitalists. I can call every one of them. I have no problem. I always part on good terms.
That's a good approach and a strategy, especially if you're going to do some serial entrepreneurship to keep the community.
Everybody has a good side and a bad side, and I understand why they need what they need.
Yeah.
So we just have a different goal in life.
So we come to this Sempra, right? I mean, we are talking about now we are in your life. We have reached the stage where you have founded Sempra.
Mm-hmm.
You have, I think, licensed that molecule in. Is that solithromycin?
Yeah, I licensed a whole library of molecules from Optimer. Optimer was developing a drug which I had discovered at Abbott in my team for C. difficile colitis. It's now called fidaxomicin and approved. Mm-hmm. I was the first one to ever publish on that from Abbott. So I was on the advisory team of Optimer. And so I was able to take their macrolide program, which their chemists had made, and take that and start Sempra, because they had other, they had fidaxomicin. They wanted to move forward in some sugar chemistry. Barry Sharpless, who's the Nobel laureate, second Nobel laureate here.
Yeah, second.
He was on the board of that company, so I knew him there.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I know that, I know a little bit of the Sempra story. I mean, you can read about it. So it had a liver toxicity and...
No, it did not have liver toxicity. I take that back. No. So let me tell you what happened with it. Yeah. It's an analog of telithromycin or Ketak. And so the FDA was very nervous about it. We did not have liver toxicity, but because it's an analog of Ketak, they were afraid of releasing it for the community. Here's where I differed from my investors. Remember, we were a public company. We were a public company for 6 years before this happened. I had raised lots of money. I'd raised over $500 million, for Sempra. Plus BARDA, the government had funded it for pediatrics. It was in pediatrics, no toxicity seen. The problem was the FDA was afraid somewhere along the line, before you did 40 to 50,000 people, somebody would die. Somebody's bound to die, because that's what life is about. But they were afraid and they would get blamed, because previously some of the FDA people had lost their jobs based on this thing. So they just said, so they said, you need to do at least 10,000 patients and come back to us, or 8,000 patients or something like that. And the investors did not want to do that and wanted to find a buyer. That's when I retired, 2016. I was going to turn 70 and I said, okay, I'm going to retire. Plus I had other personal things. My sister in India was very sick and bedridden and stuff. I needed to get there. And I said, okay, enough is enough. If you are on a different path of selling the company, I'm not going to be part of this.
So there was no biomarker for this toxicity that could have been evaluated?
Yeah, we had looked at the acetylcholine nicotinic acid receptors and shown that it did not hit that like Ketak did. But the FDA didn't want to even listen to any of it. They didn't look. In fact, I've published an article in Journal of Medicinal Chemistry. I spoke at the American Society of Microbiology. And that was when the FDA was actually shamed. And none of the people who actually downed our drug were actually at the FDA anymore.
So you're clearly not a quitter, right? I mean, you have faced problems, and I mean, you finally retired when you were nearing 70, which many people retire when they are 65 or 60. So you were already 10 years past the normal people when start thinking about retirement. So that is good. But what, I mean, would you have at any point of time, and there's a question from somebody in the audience, think about coming back to India? I mean, you have done a lot of good work there. Would India have been a hospitable place for you to come back to and do things? You must have thought about it or explored it and... What
No, I did not, because my children are here, right? So my children, my daughter is right now in Europe, but you know, I'm more American than Indian right now. Remember, I've lived in the US for 50 years. I
Okay.
don't know my way around India. I don't know all the bureaucracy in India. I know how to get things done here.
Okay.
And so, you know, I can help India, like with GARDP, I help for treating people in India. I can do more for India outside India than in India, I think, today.
Okay.
You know, and now I'm chair of the National Biodefense. So I moved into more policy work, more government work, but I'm on the board of 3 companies here in the US, you know, so things are moving. I'm actually in the board of 8 companies and 8 things.
So you never had a thought about, yes, I can go to India and do a startup there or work somewhere there. I mean, it never
In the
really
first
crossed my
5
mind.
years,
Mm.
first 5 years after leaving India, one thinks of coming back to India, but after that, no.
Okay.
I mean, I would love to come back and tie there, but you know, you know, there's no perfect country, and I have enough money to go back and forth. I can come to India as many times as I want.
Yeah.
You know, I can have the best of India without having to worry about working there.
Somebody's asking, what about work-life balance? I mean,
No, you have to give up some. There's no 2 ways about it. You know,
but
I
there is
have
no
2 children
balance.
at home. Yeah, so you know, it's hard. You know, when your children are very young, they want you to be there in the school with all the other parents when they're there for school activities. I didn't have time for all this stuff. I was traveling most of the time. So I had a live-in housekeeper, and she was staying with us to look after. I have dogs also, and so, you know, Mike was also very helpful. And so, you know, between the 2 of us, we managed. It's not easy, but I know my daughter, older one especially, she says, you know, the other parents have done nothing. You have. So as the daughter, you know, gets to be 17, 18, when the children get to be a little bit older, they realize they can be proud of your parents instead of saying my mother's not doing anything.
Yeah, yeah. So, in retrospect, you might not change anything about how you went about your career, right? I mean, there might be things that you feel
Oh,
you
I
could
would not.
have done.
I would have done more studying in school if I had to do my life over.
Okay.
In school, I was a real, you know, I was an athlete. I played all the time. I didn't really, you know, school was boring. So, you know, I didn't think it was, you know, so I hardly ever studied.
You're talking about high school. You're not talking about
Yeah,
before
I went
your
to Baldwin Girls
bachelor's.
in Bangalore. Yeah.
Where did you go to in Bangalore?
Baldwin Girls High School.
Baldwin Girls High School. Okay. Okay. So, few more questions on AMR, right? That's really your policy work on AMR, etc., is probably putting you in the center of this pandemic, as it is being called.
Yes,
Do you
very
think
busy.
are you really worried? I mean, is there any hype about it, or is it truly something that's going to be disastrous for us?
So I think for my generation, we will always have some antibiotics for, you know, when you take mixtures of antibiotics, 2 or 3 of them, combinations, they would probably work for the general infections. However, if I were to have a transplant or a stem cell or, you know, cancer, and then you get treated and you get some of these horrible bacteria, which are multi-drug resistant, there may be no treatment. So there will be a small sector of people who will not have any antibiotics to treat. So yes, for them, it's very serious. Now, there are new therapies coming along for them, like phage therapies and so on, which goes back to Mechnikov, right? From the 18th century, long time ago, when phages were used for therapy. In the Ganges, they tried to get rid of cholera by using bacteriophages and stuff. So, you know, it was, it's going back to those days, and there are some new compounds coming forward. So I think it's too much of an alarmist to say, oh, all these multi-drug resistant pathogens are going to kill the whole world. No, the drugs which we tested in Vellore in India in 1968, 69 are still active today on many, many bacteria. So there's a whole bunch of antibiotics which can be used. We need some new classes of drugs, new compounds, new targets, which will work, but not just against gram-negatives, but also pneumococcus and staph and others. So, but they can happen. The problem is who's going to fund it, because investors are not interested in it. It doesn't make money. So this is where the governments come in, GARDP comes in, WHO comes in.
So maybe the alarmism is linked to the fact that it's hard to raise money. So unless you're alarmist, people are not going to put money into it. So it's more of a strategy to get attention. Now, one question I have is, there are countries which have great antibiotic stewardship, and there are countries which have lousy antibiotic stewardship. Now, the countries where they have great antibiotic stewardship, they probably did not have great antibiotic stewardship several decades ago. I mean, it is antibiotic stewardship is the sensitivity to managing how you use antibiotics has happened in the last 20 years. So my question to you is, when you shift a place, a location, let's say all of Belgium, it shifts from being poor antibiotic stewardship to good antibiotic stewardship, does it actually see a decline in MDRs and bad organisms? Or, I mean, is that proven that yes, if good antibiotics will lead to a decline in MDR from a high peak before? That's the question.
For some antibiotics, it will go down. The bacteria will lose their plasmids because the selective pressure is not there. But for others, it may not go away. But remember, it doesn't matter where there is stewardship and where there is no stewardship, because bacteria don't need passports and visas. They travel with you. If I come to India, I come back with bacteria which is in the environment there. So if it's bad in one place, it'll be bad in another place. And that's why the New Delhi strain is now everywhere in the world, you know?
Okay.
And yes, there'll be a little bit less elsewhere, but it's still here.
So one of the common drugs we used to use when I was a medical student was sulfanilamide, and
It's still a good drug.
oxazole. Are they still relevant in this
Yes,
antibiotic resistant era?
Bactrim is still one of the best drugs there is.
Because hardly ever prescribed in India.
Trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole called Bactrim is one of the best drugs still is used.
Okay.
You know, a lot of people are allergic to sulfur. I personally am allergic to sulfur. So, you know, you can't take that if you have that. So trimethoprim, if it's sold by itself, and it's sold in some countries by itself, could be used on someone like me. You know, and there's no true synergy like was originally published.
Okay. So do the sulfurs also induce resistance? I have not heard of sulfur resistance. Is that there? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, you have resistance to sulfur drugs.
Okay. In that case, if a certain community did not use sulfurs for 2 decades, will the organisms revert to their original phenotype and become sulfur sensitive? That's, in other words, I think this concept is spoken of as cycling of antibiotics. You use one antibiotic and then shift another antibiotic and then keep shifting so that the organism cannot stabilize.
It depends again. Yeah, so I don't know if the sulfides, if it's plasmid carried, you can lose it. Okay. But if it's integrated into the chromosome, you may not lose it.
Okay, so if it is stably incorporated into the genomic material, then there's really no escaping from that until you completely eradicate it, and then, okay.
And that won't happen.
It won't happen, you're saying?
That won't happen.
Okay, okay.
It's hard to eradicate any bacterial species. They're too smart for us.
Okay. And bacterial genomes cannot be, I mean, you cannot direct evolution in bacterial genomes by creating artificial selective pressure. Can you in the laboratory? Can you
do a little bit, like with copper and stuff, but it's too expensive, and you can't do it, you know, in the environment. The biggest problem right now is not, I think, usage in the hospital. There's some in the community, but the biggest problem is agricultural and growth promoter use. So if I had to say, how would you limit antibiotic resistance? You know, don't use the drugs in the growth promoter agricultural area, chicken feed, fish farms. But then those animals and things get infected. How do you treat them? You have to have different classes of drugs, which have to be cheap for them.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you can't have the same mode of action. So, for instance, the FDA will approve drugs which are different, you know, from what's used in humans. But just because it has a different name, it doesn't mean, you know, it's the same class. It's a fluoroquinolone. It's going to be cross-resistant to the other one, you see.
Okay.
So if it's a different drug, it doesn't make a difference. As long as it's the same target and same mode of action, you're going to have cross-resistance.
Okay.
You know, like in India, a lot of polymyxin B was used, and in China, and now you have polymyxin B resistance, which was it's a toxic drug, but was a drug of last resort for the immunocompromised patients in the hospital. And now you can't use it anymore with MCR1 resistance.
Yeah. So then the other question is, should we really focus on, or one of the reasons for misuse of antibiotics is that doctors do not have a firm diagnosis on the organism that is infecting someone. So they just use a broad spectrum. They use the best broad spectrum because, I mean, they are not caring about this population at large. They're caring about this patient.
One patient.
And they want immediate relief. They want guaranteed relief. So they will just take the biggest weapon in the arsenal. So if we had better diagnostics, if I can tell within 20 minutes that this person has got this organism with this resistance pattern, can we then use narrow spectrum antibiotics like you use Astriona, which avoids disturbing the microflora?
Yeah. So, I'm very much for diagnostics. In fact, I'm on the board of a diagnostic company just for that. I'm very much impressed with diagnostics. Now you can get diagnostics in 8 to 12 hours, sometimes 6 hours, but they're expensive. That's the problem. The cost is the problem because, obviously it takes technology and experience to do it.
Okay.
It's like, why don't you do PCR for diagnosing every COVID? It's expensive. So you use the antigen test, which is cheaper and faster. So, but the problem with bacteria is, in the blood culture, if any bacteria is found, it's an infection because you can't have a bacteria in your blood, right? But when you take a sputum culture, you have to take a bronch. You have multiple organisms in there. So if you identify all of them, doesn't mean it's a pathogen. It could be a colonizer. And the same thing with the pure culture in the urinary tract, yes. But sometimes you have contaminants. Gut flora, you'll have gut flora everywhere. That's a problem when you have mixed cultures. You need a differentiation counts. And so it's a little bit more. You do have some, the problem with doctors now is they start you. So let's say with COVID, patients got treated with ceftriaxone and azithromycin. One broad spectrum took care of all the gram negatives, and then the azithromycin took care of some of the pneumococcus and pneumococcus is mostly resistant. They still used it. And they used both of these, and that took care of
the consequence of that.
But in 24 hours, when you get a response back from the laboratory, what pathogen it is, if the drug is already working, the doctor doesn't bother. He's got other things to focus on. He's not going to change the antibiotic. That's the problem. If you change the antibiotic in the 24 hours when you got your diagnostic results, then that would be fine.
Yeah. So
but they
what
don't
you're saying is a 24-hour exposure to a broad spectrum is unlikely to induce resistance.
That's correct.
It takes several days of continuous
repeated exposure, right?
Yeah. So that.
But they don't change it, and that's part of the problem. And we are getting to a point in the United States where in the big hospitals, at least, they will be forced to change depending on the diagnostics, what's allowed, because the cost, is the driver. But other countries may not care so much, especially if they're generic antibiotics, which are cheaper, they'll be focused on doing other things for the patient.
Yeah. So you already commented on PARG therapy. You said, is there anything in the pipeline in terms of PARG? We had a company, we still have Gangajan in Bangalore, which works on PARG therapies. But
phage therapy is now a big thing. In fact, one of the AMR funds, which is paying out from the big company and Welcome Investments and Barda Investments, one of the companies funded is Infector Farm, which is a phage company.
Okay. And how about antibodies or drugs?
Antibody therapy is very hard, firstly because of expense and because the bugs will get resistant, and then you cannot use the antibodies twice because you will have serum sickness, getting antibodies. So it's a little bit harder, and antibodies don't get inside mammalian cells. So if you have the intracellular pathogen, it will hide there until the antibody goes away and comes right back out. So antibody therapy is much harder.
Okay, great. So I kind of finished the science question. There are a few more questions coming in. I just had one non-science question, if you will permit me. So you did, do you think it's for a startup entrepreneur, would you have been better off doing an MBA? I know that you have done a course at Wharton, right? No, finance for non-finance people, right? But that was a short certificate course possibly. I'm thinking, would it be good to finish a PhD and then do an MBA and then get into the entrepreneurial world, or you don't think that makes a difference?
Not for me those days. And I think I learned much of it, on my feet. I don't think an MBA really knows as much as you learn on your own.
Okay.
I don't think it's needed. I mean, I've met a lot of MBAs. Most people don't know anything, really, they know it on paper, but when it comes to real issues, there's no typical case, you know what I mean? And the typical cases are what I described. And so, but it certainly helps you now when you go into the bean counting world, that you've got to have an MBA. And it's, to me.
Would an MBA have been allowed you to convince your VCs?
Oh, I convinced them, believe me, I had no problem. Remember in 2008, 2009, I raised money in the worst financial times in US history.
I have a feeling your VCs were scared of you. So I have another question here that was very specific. What do you say about clarithromycin resistance in Helicobacter pylori? I don't know.
Yeah, it's relatively sad. Yeah, so Helicobacter many of them have become, there's about 18% resistance in Helicobacter to clarithromycin. And to most of the others. There's a new rifampin analog, which seems to be working, but that also will get resistant. So we need a new mode of action, which works only in the gut and is used only for Helicobacter. See, the problem is many of these antibiotics are used for multiple infections, for a strep throat, for a lung infection, for another infection of some other kind, urinary tract infection, and you use it on Helicobacter, by which time, the Helicobacter is sitting in your gut, and so it'll get resistant during all these other treatments. So if you can make a drug just for Helicobacter, then the chances it will get resistance is going to be lower.
So are you again saying that's narrow spectrum antibiotic? Either spectrum because bioavailability is limited. You don't want it to get absorbed.
Yeah, but and you want it to work in an acid pH in the gut is very acidic, right? So,
yeah. So you could have something that gets degraded in the alkaline pH of the duodenum. Yeah, okay. So there is another question. Chromosomal persistence genes called the toxin antitoxin genes. Now I know nothing about this. Does that ring a bell for you?
No. Say that again.
What about the chromosomal persistence genes called as toxin antitoxin genes?
No, I don't know what they're talking about.
Okay.
You'll have to mention the pathogen and the toxin.
Okay. So you did a startup. You did several startups in your life. Would you recommend that for a scientist? And would you recommend that for a scientist in India? I mean, two separate questions.
There are a number of things you have to do, and that's why I do recommend reading Startup, the book. And it's not just my opinion, but 10 different people have spoken there in that book. It's by a fellow called Rippey, J.J. Rippey. And so, firstly, you have to have a stomach for it. I mean, every day is not a smooth day. You have to be working. I worked 7 days of the week for almost every day of my life for 50 years. I don't take vacations. I don't take Christmas, New Year, Diwali, whatever. I don't do any of that. 7 days of the work, I work. Even in retirement, I'm working 7 days of the week. I don't know why, but I work, And so you have to be reading widely. You have to have thick skin. Some people will down whatever you're proposing, and they may call you names, so you have a thick skin. So you have to really be putting up with a lot and coming back with a lot, like they say, you have to kiss a lot of frogs before you find your prince.
But are these acquired characteristics, or were you born like that? I mean, did you have this when you were in school?
I was always crazy.
Okay. So it may not be easy to kind of acquire it. I mean, you may suffer a lot before you acquire it and then sail through. Understand. So
but there is no clear path how to do that. So my definite thing is tell people, get as broad an education as you can. Don't be afraid of trying something new. Keep on trying, learn more and more. No knowledge is ever wasted. Everything I've learned has come in handy to help different people. And whether even in engineering, try to understand it. Try to understand chemistry, try to understand many things. I mean, people talk to me like I'm a chemist and say, "You're not a chemist?" I say, "No, I'm not a chemist." "How come you published it?" So you do. You have to learn it. And just because it's not your initial degree, you don't have to say, "I don't know." You try to learn by talking to people and learn. So that's number one. Number two is don't be afraid to challenge things and don't be afraid to do different things. And for Indians, what I feel sad is Indians, when they leave India, have clever ideas. I mean, look at the heads of all of the different companies here. Many of them, Amazon, they're all Indians. How come in India you can't be brilliant? Why do you have to leave India to be brilliant, right? So Indians have to realize they don't have to copy somebody in America, somebody in Europe, somebody in Germany, or Japan, to come up with something new. Indians can come up with something new in India and be the first, either the first in class or the best in class can be identified in India. You don't have to copy anybody else. And you have to be there early.
It's, I mean, we hear this many times that you can do this in India. But you know, in the US, you have a supportive ecosystem, which I would say does not even exist to that extent in some parts of Europe, right? The US is unique in the way in not punishing you for failure. They may not reward you for failure, but they don't punish you for failure. For example, each time you have had a reversal or something like that, you bounce back quickly. I mean, is that, and many people attribute it to the American way of doing things, that they may not celebrate failure. That's kind of an extreme thing, but they certainly don't punish you, say that, oh, you failed, therefore we won't hire you, or we don't think. I mean, the Dar Pharma people approached you and hired you, right? Because you are not even a dopamine receptor specialist, but they saw something in you and they went out and hired you. It's a very psychological trait thing, where that they are observing somebody, they say, this person has got the traits to succeed. And that's what we want. We don't care whether they know the science, because the science they can learn. But if you don't have the traits, you're not going to succeed even if you know the subject very well. So that may not be there in India. I think I think
it's part of the education. So yeah. I saw how my children were educated. You know, in India, you know, at least when I grew up, I don't know how education is now. It might be different. But in India, education was very, you know, textbook wrote, and you had to write out whatever was in the textbook. I remember asking my biology teacher, maybe when I was in 6th standard, why does an insect have to go through these 4 different forms before it becomes the adult? Why does it have to suffer through chrysalis and pupa and caterpillar and all these things? You know, why can't it just become a butterfly? You know, like we are born. And she said, you're questioning God. And I got into trouble. I got kicked out of class. You know, but I was always a troublemaker, you know. So, but now, you know, then you're brilliant if you actually worked on it and then discovered why it did all these things. Mm-hmm. So in India, you were not allowed to think out of the box. Mm-hmm. Here, you're allowed to think out of the box. Mm-hmm. And the other thing you do in the US in school is that you cross-fertilize. You know, they combine history and mathematics, or history and biology, and you cross-fertilize. In India, I had history means only history and then only geography. You never combine 2 different things. Maybe they do that now there, but they do that here. And I saw that in my children's education. They combine 2 or 3 different things, and arts is combined with maths and stuff like that.
So those kinds of things are happening now. We do have both investors as well as the government doing many things. But if you have a country where the general income levels are quite low, so people don't have huge savings, right? Then their first concern is for stability in their careers. And there is also the issue of marriage, which is a very different institution in India. Your many spouses do not work, and therefore you have a mouth to feed even. And these commitments may not be there as much in the US, where it's often both people working, or they have other ways to manage. So I think until the economic situation changes in a big way, at least the average Indian may not be able to become an entrepreneur, but certainly some of us are fortunate enough to have acquired wealth through our families. And I think for them, and I think those are the people who are actually setting up companies now, because you do have lots of good startups in India. But we also need a cushioning system that allows people to fail and then,
you know, and actually one of my billionaire friends who visited India came back and told me there's very little philanthropy in India. That's one of the reasons we are doing some of the philanthropy with my parents' work. Not some, I mean, we're doing the whole thing. All of the money there is going back to India. So, you know, if some of the billionaires, India has some big billionaires, why don't they invest back into companies? You know, they don't do venture capital investing and so on. So somehow, if you can get venture capitalists Indian venture capitalists investing in Indian companies, you would start to see it.
Yeah, yeah. I think Ignite is also looking at doing these proof of concept funding, where we find academics who have got great ideas. They just need to do a few experiments to take them to a point where an investor might be interested.
Mhm.
And Ignite is raising capital from donors to fund those projects. And one thing I have realized is that while science takes money, but we also need high quality science. The problem is we often think of science in a very woolly headed manner. It is something up there in the clouds. Science is a very practical, here and now thing because it results in products. And the connection between science and creating wealth is not tangibly made in India because it's not happened enough times in a visible manner. Whereas if you go to Boston, you see so many billionaires who became billionaires because they were scientists. They invented something in the lab and then they formed a company and became a billionaire. That has not happened enough in India for that culture to percolate. But I think companies like Ignite are trying to create that mentality or the mindset that yes, science has to be high quality, and one way to prove that it is high quality is actually make something that other people can use and then make money doing that. So I think somebody's asking you to repeat the name of the startup book. Maybe if you can just.
It's called Startup.
It's called Startup, and the author is
Startup, and the author is
Rippy.
J.J. Rippy, R-I-P-P-Y.
R-I-P-P-Y. And it's available on Amazon, right?
Oh, I'm sure.
Okay, so I think I am pretty much done with the questions. I think we have answered most of these questions here. If anybody has a question, please put it on the chat box now, but there is nothing.
I have one comment, which
Yeah,
I
please.
thought about. I thought somebody would ask, and nobody's asked. So let me ask people whether they would be interested in this. You know, when you plan for something, don't look at what America is doing and what US is doing and do something similar. Think about what your country needs or America needs or whatever area you're working in will need. You know, look in your crystal ball and say, what will be needed 10 years from now, 15 years from now? That's what you should be working on. Not something which is needed today, because you're not going to get to it today. So be futuristic. And if you think about where medicine is going, it may not be small molecules in the future. You know, we may not be treating the symptoms of disease, which is what we do, except in anti-infectives. In all other things, we treat the symptoms of the disease, right? You try to lower the lipids, decrease the lipids, and we don't treat the disease. Except now with gene therapy, we are starting to change the cause of the disease. So we've got to address the cause. Many of the herbals we have does address the cause of the disease. So do think about addressing the cause of the disease. You know, I bet you in 40 years, 30 years, 40 years from now, people will be saying, look at what they did. They gave these toxic drugs orally and IV to people while we now fix the cause of the disease.
So what you're saying, Prabha, is that if you're a small molecule chemist, start looking for a job outside the pharmaceutical.
No, you can use a small molecule to change the gene.
Oh, good. There is room for optimism there as well.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
unless there are a few more questions, but I think we have covered them and we're kind of running out of time.
Okay.
Swami, could you please quickly have a look at the question answer box?
The chat box?
Chat box, no, question
the
answer
Q&A
box. Yeah, the
Okay,
Q&A
sorry,
box.
I haven't been seeing that. I'm seeing the chat box.
Yeah.
Prabha, just give me a minute.
Okay.
I will check this out and see if there is something we have not already covered. So you have already answered where the biopharmaceutical industry is heading. How do you deal with toxicity in the lab and politics? You've already kind of addressed that. And basically you said to develop a thick skin and do your work so well that people can't use anything against you. Are there any is there any about? So there's a question here, and I think I know the answer. Who was driving you to work so hard that time, even after facing so much discrimination? I think you were self-driven. I don't think anybody was driving you.
Nobody drove me hard.
Yeah. I mean, if I may share, since I know your husband, Mike, right, and he's the softest of persons. He's almost,
right.
he's almost I mean, it's a black and white difference between the two of you, right? So he's obviously not the person who told you to go and challenge these guys. Okay.
No, maybe I should say my mother was my thing. She wanted women to perform. She was way ahead of her time.
Yeah, yeah. Usually there is a figure like that in our lives. And you lived with your mother when you were in Bangalore?
Yeah. I was with my mother in Bangalore and my father. My father was Chief Justice. So yeah.
Okay, okay. Okay. Yeah, I think there are some general questions, but I think they have been addressed in some tangential way in this conversation. We've already talked about the Helicobacter pylori thing. There is a question about, I already asked you about antibodies and bacterial infection. There's a question about CAR T cell therapy for multi-drug resistance. Is that a thing even?
Yeah, it could be with CRISPR. I don't know, CAR T. If you want to enhance your immune system, it might help, but it's temporary, right? Because it's both T cells, B cells, as well as antibodies. So it's going to be hard to address with CAR T, but you can use CRISPR to take out the drug resistance gene. You could do that. And there are people working on that, I believe. Yeah.
Okay. I had a question related to that. That is, we have innate immunity and we have our adaptive immunity. If you had to have multiple treatments for an organism, there are also means to stimulate innate immunity. For example, there are ENPP1 inhibitors, which I heard of the other day, which increases CGAMP, which then triggers the STING pathway. So is that also something that is exciting in terms of antimicrobials, or?
So, the enhancement of the innate system is very important. You know that BCG may have helped decrease, although there has been controversy about that, decrease the effect of COVID even, so BCG is definitely enhances your innate system. It helps you again prevent TB, but also helps your innate system for resistance.
Yeah.
It's being thought about more for cancer and more for other diseases, but not for antibacterials as much, maybe for antivirals a little bit, but not for bacteria.
Okay. And also you have bacteria that have a long residence intracellularly, right?
Like typhi, yeah.
Like TB. I mean, and I guess you need different approaches for bacteria that are
That's
primarily
right.
extracellular and
So
bacteria that.
many different, and you say bacteria, it's like so many different, and sometimes more than one bug is causing a disease. That's part of the complexity of treatment.
Yeah, yeah. So there is a question about in vitro efficacy data, like MICs and things like that, right? And then you go to the in vivo situation and they don't pan out. Is there anything specific?
PKPD.
Yeah, yeah.
PKPD will
Okay.
help you do it very well, and you can really predict what's going to happen later.
So if you knew the concentration of the drug that's reaching the target site, it correlates very well with your in vitro MICs, you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, and in a disease model, infection. So, it will work in that infection, in that model. So in that organ will do what it's predicted to do. The PK and then the PD is the pharmacodynamics.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. It's only a 1 minute away before we have to close.
Okay.
I think I'll take this chance to thank Prabha for patiently engaging with us, being very candid about her career. I mean, she has had a roller coaster of a life. I think many people would have given up 1/3 of the way, but she's not only at the end of that journey, but she's making her end of the journey look like the beginning of something new. So I'm full of admiration, because we need people like Prabha to contribute to these challenges we face in terms of antimicrobial resistance and things like that. So I hope you will continue doing what you're doing with the same energy you showed when I first met you in the late 90s, when both of us were a lot younger. And you had the same energy you have today, but I have definitely changed. So thank you very much, Prabha, and I will hand over back to the organizers and the show coordinators.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the organizers too from me.
Yeah, thanks. Suchi?
Thank you, Swami. Thank you, Prabha. It was a lovely
Thank you,
talk.
Krishna.
And after listening to you, only one thing is coming to my mind, which is the phoenix bird, that is born out of fire. That sort of thing is coming out in my mind that, what a personality you have, like a fire. So, yeah, thank you so much for joining today,
Very welcome.
Swami.
Yeah,
Thank you for conducting the session. I would like to thank all the participants for joining, and I love the fact that whoever joined, they stayed on throughout the session.
And we will be giving subscriptions to Shastra for the 8 best questions if we can find 8 really good ones.
It's a great magazine. I looked it up online. Try to get it. Yeah, I'm going to get it.
It's very promising. We need to support the magazine. We'll do that.
Okay, so let's wrap up. And this webinar was part of the In Conversation with Ignite webinar series. This is the 5th event, and this is organized in collaboration with Cactus Life Science Foundation and Cactus Communications and Ignite Life Science Foundation with IndiaBioscience. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Good morning to Prabha, and good night,
Bye-bye,
good evening
everyone.
to everyone.
Thank you very
bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great conversation. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.